Give me a little intro there, Gomer.
There's no turning back now.
Let's put on the show.
You're listening to the Station 71 podcast. My name is Mario, and this week I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Beth?
And Brian.
So, as determined a couple weeks ago, no news. Still kind of holding out hope that we'll see that announcement that everything goes back to normal and we could start talking about Disney park openings soon.
But we do have a new patron to our Patreon, Sarah, so we wanted to give her a welcome shout out as promised. We're really excited to have you on board. That being said, we also kind of did a little bit of restructuring to our Patreon to try and give you guys a little bit more value. So our pre-show is now in the lowest tier, our $2 tier. If you want to hear our unscripted, unedited ramblings before we start recording, you can just subscribe to that $2 tier and hear all those. We are still going to have the post-show at the $4 tier, and then our really exciting news is at our $6 tier, we're going to start doing at least monthly mini episodes. So this past week, I guess it was, we did a happy half-hour mini episode where each of us made a little drink, played some Disney-related drinking games, and just kind of chatted about some, I guess, less family-friendly topics. It's not going to be edited, like I said, so may not be one for the kids to listen to, the mini episodes, but it'll be really fun, and I'm excited about those.
I do think we're not as not safe for work as that may allude to, though.
Yeah, we're
True.
not intentionally bringing up topics that you wouldn't want to hear about, but, you know, we let a few things slip here and there.
We're still the
Right.
same host, same environment, just a little bit
More unfiltered.
yes, that's better.
Yes. It's a better way to say it.
And just to kind of give you an idea on what our pre-show post-show is, just because that's kind of vague, and as you were saying that, I kind of realized that we usually have more or less candid discussions before we start the show. Like this week we talked about video games for 15 minutes before we started recording, and then we started talking about like actually planning stuff for the podcast, so you get to experience some of what goes into making the podcast. Depending on what people want, I could always potentially do stuff about editing too, if that's, you know, things that you're interested in. But we want to kind of tailor this more towards like, one, there's more of us if that's what you're looking for. And we're going to try to do a lot more content that makes the Patreon worth it. But as far as
Kind of get to know us a little better.
yeah, as far as pre-show and post-show go, it's usually us either like talking a little bit about some of the stuff we're going to talk about on the show, planning, or just like, hey, how was your week? Which is also kind of fun too, in a weird way.
Yeah.
So that said, any other updates that we had before we roll into this week's episode?
Oh, also just as a benefit to all patrons, we do have a Patreon exclusive Discord channel, which is going to feature a chat, so patron only chat, and also updates, so you'll have everything you need in one little easy spot.
Yes. So a little bit about that too, since that's stuff I set up. The Patreon only chat right now is like just us. We are pretty active in our Discord right now, so like you do get like a little bit more of just our attention, as weird as that sounds. But also the update feed is pretty cool because it connects directly to the Patreon, and anytime like new content is posted, it'll publish in there, and you'll actually get a notification that says, hey, there's this new thing that's out. So if you're looking for all that extra content, the Discord is part of our Patreon. I think it's part of the lowest tier, right?
All tiers.
Okay, so since it's in the all tiers category, you get the notifications about everything that goes in there, and it's a nice way to kind of keep track of this stuff if you don't actively check your podcast or Patreon app. Like I don't, because I realized this week that I had a ton of podcasts that I wasn't caught up on.
Plus, with the patron chat, I feel like as active as we all are in the regular Discord, it's easy to get lost in the fray because it is pretty active on certain days. Mm-hmm. So the patron chat, I feel like, is a little more intimate. So you're definitely going to get our attention better on that one.
Yes, more intimate is definitely the best way of putting that. But that said, I think that's all I had, unless you guys had anything else you wanted to talk about before we roll right into this.
Nope.
Okay, so picking up where we left off last week, I'm going to turn this over to Brian again as we continue our discussion on Walt Disney.
Yeah, so for anybody that hasn't listened to last week's episode, I would suggest you listen to that first. But what we're doing is we're starting kind of this series where we're going to go through and focus on each, or at least one, Imagineer every week and kind of go in depth on all the stuff that they did. But we're kind of kicking the whole thing off with a Walt biography that's going to get stretched out over to be determined number of episodes. So this is part 2 of that. And we're just going to really jump right back into where we left off last week. But for those that missed it, Walt has now just returned home from Chicago from France, where he was serving as a Red Cross ambulance driver. And after spending much of his time in Europe focusing on drawing, he had big plans of becoming a cartoonist now that he was stateside again. However, Elias was not supportive of this and was expecting Walt to work alongside him at the Ozell Fruit, Juice, and Jelly Manufacturing Company. But instead, Walt moved back to Kansas City in the fall of 1919, determined to follow his passion. Though it had consumed a large part of his childhood, Walt first tried to secure a job at the Kansas City Star, the same paper he, Roy, and Elias had delivered 4 years earlier. He first tried to acquire a job as an office boy, but was told he was too old. Afterwards, he applied to the transportation department, but again had no luck. Growing distressed, he turned to Roy, who was working as a bank teller in Kansas City at the time. One of Roy's co-workers had friends who ran a commercial art store and had an opening for an apprentice. That same day, Walt took a portfolio of the drawings he had made in France and applied. He was told that they would bring him on for a 1-week trial and then determine his salary, to which Walt happily agreed. So, as anybody that listened to last week's episode or knows a good bit of Disney history will know that Walt had a lot of experience working without getting paid. So this probably seemed like a great deal to him because there would be some money at some point. A 17-year-old Walt had felt as though he'd truly made it and achieved his goal as a professional artist. At this position, though, he was really only responsible for rough sketches for advertisements and catalogs. He then handed over the rough sketches to the 2 owners, Louis Pesman and William Rubin, who would then make the actual advertisements. The job didn't allow Walt much creative freedom, but instead focused heavily on efficiency. However, it did teach Walt a number of techniques that he would use throughout his career. Regardless of how much it fit in Walt's dream of becoming an artist, he felt it was a huge accomplishment. He specifically recalled visiting his Aunt Margaret, the same who had gifted him his first Big Chief drawing tablet, to tell her that he was now being paid to draw pictures. Unfortunately, though, Walt's time at Pesman Rubin was short-lived. By December, only 6 weeks after he started working there, the rush for Christmas advertising was over, and he was let go. However, his time there wasn't completely wasted. It had given him a foot in the door, and perhaps more importantly, it was where he met Ub Iwerks. Ub was a fellow illustrator at Pesman Rubin, though he and Walt's similarities ended there. While Walt focused on style and caricature, Ub mainly drew lettering for the advertisements. Ub was also much more reserved than Walt, shy and soft-spoken in contrast to Walt's outgoing nature. Iwerks was laid off around the same time as Walt, and though they had only been casual acquaintances at Pesman Rubin, Ub obviously saw potential in his abilities. In January of 1920, Ub approached Walt with the idea of starting an advertising business together. He believed Walt's gregarious nature would be perfect for drumming up business, and each of their artistic talents would enable them to complete entire projects together. Thus, their partnership, named Iwerks Disney, was born. In order to purchase the equipment for their business, Walt reached out to his parents in Chicago for them to withdraw his savings and send it to him in Kansas City. When he told Elias what the funds were going to be used for, his father unsurprisingly refused to send him the money, saying it was a waste. Over many back and forth letters, Walt finally convinced him to send him half of his savings. Now that they were up and running, Walt set about securing advertisement jobs. He reached out to his childhood friend Walt Pfeiffer, whose father was in charge of the United Leather Workers Journal. He convinced him to let him design the cover for the journal's February issue, along with some other artwork within it. After that, Walt began visiting various printing companies, offering to let iWorks Disney be their advertising company. Walt's charisma ended up landing a decent number of jobs for the two. All told, Ub and Walt made around $130 their first month, which was more than the two made combined at Pessman Rubin.
Wow.
Yeah. It was just pretty cool when you think, like, after a first month of just a startup with very little funds, very little experience in the industry at all, and they're already doing pretty well for themselves.
Right. And that, that money translates to a very different number today than it did then.
Oh, yes. Even though their startup seemed to be taking off quite quickly, Walt was ever restless and looking for more. Advertisements were giving him a start in the art business, but he wasn't ready to give up on his dream of becoming a cartoonist yet. He continued to look for cartoonist jobs at various papers and wasn't above using a few tricks to get himself in. Because they were doing advertisement jobs for various papers, Walt would be given plates from businesses, which Disney and iWorks would make their designs on and give them back to the printers. They would acquire extra plates or have leftover spaces on some of them. Walt would take these and draw original cartoons on them, then surround it with fake newspaper stories and print them out on newspaper stock. On his job hunt, he would present these fake newspapers with his art in them to make it seem as he'd been published before.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Which, oh man, I have loved doing the research for especially this last week, because you're going to see a couple more times, like, he did some pretty sneaky stuff when he was getting started, just to kind of get his foot in the door in places. But I thought that one was pretty good.
Hey, you do what you gotta do, and I mean that's
fake it till you make it, baby.
Exactly. Eventually, though, it was Ub that found a job for Walt, seeing an ad in the Kansas City Star. The Kansas City Slide Company was looking for a cartoonist, and he convinced Walt to apply. Walt joined on in February and worked out a deal with iWorks to continue running their business while he was working at the Slide Company. The Kansas City Slide Company's main business was creating advertisements that were played at the beginning of films. Though they mostly shot live-action ads, they were branching into animation and hired Walt for this reason. The techniques they used were crude, even by the time standards. Artists drew pictures and cut out any of the movable pieces. Using pins, they would hinge these movable pieces and then take various pictures, moving each piece incrementally. It was essentially a combination of stop motion and typical animation. The Slide Company cared little for artistry, though, and more focused on making the ads economically. However, Walt didn't care. He was fascinated with the process. This combination of artistry and technology took hold of him in a profound way. Those who knew him knew Walt was not one to dabble in interest, and this was no different. Not long after leaving Ub to run iWorks Disney, though, the business fell apart. Ub simply didn't have the personality or drive to go out and secure new clients, though Walt cared little, having been bit by the animation bug. The business closed and Ub joined Walt at the Kansas City Slide Company, doing lettering for the advertisements. Walt was now pouring himself into this new endeavor. He had even been approached by both the Kansas City Star and Journal-Post to work for them full-time as a cartoonist, and he turned both of them down, moving on for a dream that he'd had for many years. Animation was his passion now. This passion extended beyond his job as well. The Slide Company had an old camera that Walt convinced the owner to let him borrow. Mind you, at this point, he was living in the Bellefontaine house with Herbert and Roy. This was the same house that the Disneys had years ago in Kansas City. Herbert had stayed there after the family had moved to Chicago, and it stayed within the family, so when they came back, he just moved right back in with them. And much like previous times in the Disney family history, things would come full circle. Elias, Flora, and Ruth moved back in at this time. Ozell had gone bankrupt, and Elias found himself once again staring at financial failure. In order to make money, Elias decided to build a garage in the backyard and rent it out. Walt, however, saw an opportunity. He convinced Elias to let him set up a studio in it using the camera he borrowed for the slide company. He agreed to pay Elias $5 a month for the space, of which Roy said their father never saw a dime.
Wow.
Which I think is kind of poetic justice in a way. But
Yeah, it really
is.
And Walt spent mostly all of his free time in the studio. His family said that he would get off of work, go to the studio, and they pretty much only saw him when he came in to eat dinner. Any other time, if he had free time, he was tinkering around in this makeshift studio that he'd set up in the backyard. At this time, animation was a fairly new form of media, and because of this, its novelty was usually enough to draw audiences in. Few animators cared much for developing narratives. Even from a technical standpoint, crude animations usually accomplished the job, as was seen at Pessman Rubin. The few animators developing more artistic products discovered how tedious the process was, having to completely draw each frame from start to finish. And this was truly, every single thing in each single frame was redrawn over and over again, which is just ridiculous to think about. In late spring, Walt checked out a new book that had just arrived at his local library titled Animated Cartoons, How They Are Made, Their Origin and Development by Edwin Lutz. They were not very creative with book titles back then, I guess. It was here that Walt discovered the process of cell animation. This technique involved animators creating a detailed background drawing. Characters or any other moving objects were drawn on transparent sheets of celluloid, which is where it gets the name from, and aligned with pins to the background drawing. As a picture was taken of each frame, only the foreground characters and objects had to be redrawn, which significantly reduced the time it took to create the final product. The technique was used all the way up until the late 20th century when computer-generated images finally took over the cell drawings. Which I think is very cool to think that that process stuck around for so long.
Yeah, definitely.
Walt and the other animators at the slide company marveled at this new technique. Walt asked A.V. Collier, the owner of the company, about incorporating cell animation into the business. Collier refused, though Walt was undeterred. He, iWorks, and others from the Kansas City Slide Company, which was now changing its name to the Kansas City Film Ad Company, began taking night classes at the Art Institute and making cell animations themselves. Walt and another animator named Fred Harmon began creating short editorial cartoons. They came up with one to comment on Kansas City's slow streetcar service, in which a young man grew a beard during his time waiting on the streetcar to arrive. In early 1921, Walt approached Frank L. Newman, an owner of 3 theaters in the city, with a 1-minute reel of cartoons featuring the streetcar gag among them. They had labeled the reel Newman's Laugh-O-Grams, hoping to create more like them for Newman to show in his theater. Upon viewing them, Newman told Walt that he liked them and inquired on how much they would cost. Walt told him that they could make them for 30 cents a foot, and the two struck a deal. It wasn't until Walt left the theater that he realized he had only quoted the production cost and added no profit to the figure.
Oh, no.
Yikes.
Walt, only 19 at this time, which kind of probably explains that last point, burdened with his job at the Film Ad Company as well as taking classes at the Art Institute, was stretched thin. He decided to pull in apprentices to help him with projects. Obviously making no money himself at the time, he was only able to offer experience. Rudy Ising, an aspiring animator, took the offer, and soon the crude yet entertaining Laugh-O-Grams began appearing at the Newman theaters. Though they weren't making money, he was gaining popularity. A.V. Collier still refused to use cell animations at his business, but he began introducing Walt to clients and showed them the Laugh-O-Grams as potential work that they could do. By the fall, Walt had saved up $300 and used it to purchase a universal camera and tripod. He took out ads recruiting more animators to join his team on the promise of payment once they had started making money. One of the first ideas that Walt had was to make a series of animations parodying classic fairy tales placed in a modern setting. He called this series Laughlets and began trying to sell it to a number of theaters in Missouri and Kansas. It was initially unsuccessful, but Walt was undeterred. He was considering leaving the film ad company and focusing solely on his studio. Elias, of course, told him it was a foolish idea, but Roy provided encouragement. On May 18th, now 20 years old, Walt created a certificate of incorporation for his new animation studio, Laugh-O-Gram Films Incorporated.
You ever think about like how much those people kicked themselves? Like the people that turned him down after the fact?
Oh,
Like
so
years later,
much.
and they're like, dang it, I could have had a thing.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, and I don't know if this is maybe skipping ahead in like the whole Walt Disney timeline, like I almost wonder if those people never kicked themselves, because even though Walt always seems to find like success somewhere, you'll notice like as time goes on, he's always constantly struggling with something.
That's
So
true.
it's like at the same time, while maybe like this was a good thing for him then and paved the way for something else, like if you look further down the line, everyone considered a lot of his animation projects like not to be successful. So maybe
That's a good point.
maybe they didn't kick themselves, but they also may have been like, oh well, maybe I could have kept him on for a little bit longer.
Yeah.
At the same time Walt was pulling together his new company, his family began moving apart. Roy was recently diagnosed with tuberculosis and moved to Santa Fe. Herbert, along with his wife and daughter, moved to Portland to be with members of her family, and Elias, Flora, and Ruth soon followed them. Walt, now without his family, began pouring even more of himself into the studio. Altogether, with the few films they had produced, the equipment they had, and all the loans the members were able to secure, Laugh-O-Grams became incorporated at a value of $15,000. By incorporating, Walt was also able to pay some of the employees in shares rather than cash. 300 shares of the business were created at $50 apiece, of which Walt held 70. After distributing the rest out amongst other employees, friends, and brokers, Walt was able to rent a small office studio and gather supplies to work. Walt was young and had very little business experience, but was truly a salesman at heart. He was able to secure a number of investors in the studio, most notably John V. Cowles. Cowles was a doctor in Kansas City whom Walt knew through his uncle Robert. However, he was known much more for his investing than practicing medicine. Cowles invested in a number of small businesses in the area and became quite successful. So much so that the First National Bank even turned to him for investment advice for their holdings.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty successful guy. After meeting with Walt, he agreed to invest $2,500 in Laugh-O-Grams to begin with much more soon to follow. With just enough money to get started, Walt got to work. He had the Motion Picture News, a film trade paper, announce the company's creation. In the article, it stated that Walt had been creating films for the Newman Theater for 2 years and that he had completed 6 films to date. Neither of these things were true.
Oh boy.
There again, doing what he needs to do to get by. Walt also began pulling more members onto the team. Camera operators from film ad company, more aspiring artists, and even Walt Pfeiffer joined the studio after completing courses at the Chicago Art Institute. Walt now found himself with a business, but no business to speak of. During this time period, theaters often put on shows featuring a number of different media. Programs would usually feature a feature film, interspersed with newsreels, short comedies, vaudeville acts, and occasionally animation. However, less than a quarter of these programs featured animation at this time, and theater owners were reluctant to pay much for them. Animation simply wasn't what people were coming into the theaters to see. Walt knew he would have to push to make Laugh-O-Gram successful in this climate. One of Walt's salesmen, Leslie Mace, went with Dr. Cowles to meet with a representative of the Tennessee branch of pictorial clubs, which distributed films to church and school groups. Mace secured a deal to produce a total of 6 animations by New Year's of 1924 for a total of $11,100. However, the deal stipulated that the pictorial only needed to put down $100 at the time and pay the remaining $11,000 upon the film's completions. This meant that Laugh-O-Gram now had to produce the films almost entirely on their own dime for the hope of a future payment. Upon returning to Kansas City, Mace almost immediately quit the company. So he left them in a really, really bad spot. So with this, Walt and Laugh-O-Gram were in debt and struggling, but at least they had secured a contract. With work coming in, he was able to convince Ub Iwerks, who was still at the film ad company, to leave and work for him. Their studio was small, their equipment was crude, and in all honesty, most of the animators were not highly skilled or even very impressive artists. What they lacked in technical ability, though, Walt believed they could make up for in one key area: storytelling. The larger animation studios across the country were all still placing little focus on the narrative aspect of their films, and this is where Walt believed that they could beat them out. He took time to write out full, detailed script for the animation with stage directions as if they were live-action films, and this was something that almost none of the other studios were doing at the time. And I love this point, too, just to see how early on, even at this point where he's really kind of just making ads, he still cares so much about, the storytelling behind it. And a lot of the Laugh-O-Grams were also, they were just little short films to put before, but even with a short film, he always cared so much about storytelling.
And it's like you were saying last week, how he may not have been the best animator, but his real thing was storytelling. It's kind of funny that like you said, that was really the big the big showcase for this, was that's what they focused on, was making sure it was a good story.
And at this point too, it's funny, one thing I'll throw in here that I didn't have in the notes is apparently at one point he literally had to sit down with this team of people that he had and was like, okay, look, some of you guys y'all really do not draw very well at all. And he had to start doing like separate classes for them to be able to animate better, which is funny because, we all know that Walt wasn't particularly, he wasn't at the upper echelon of artistic abilities for sure, but, he was still having to kind of guide these people through some of the processes.
That's really funny.
It's like not being able to sing well, but still being able to tell when people are off key.
I guess that makes sense, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely something to be said about like being able to appreciate the art and knowing when the art is not good versus like actually being good at it.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good point. The team worked long hours for little pay, but most seemed to enjoy the thrill it brought. However, financials were always a concern. In order to keep the company afloat, Walt began looking for other ways to make money. On the weekends, they would take the camera out and try to capture footage such as accidents that they would be able to sell. Occasionally, they would even stage some in order to have something to sell.
That's crazy.
There it is again, that entrepreneurship.
I mean, that's one way to put it.
At one point, Walt also began advertising that Laugh-O-Gram would take baby pictures in the studio. John Cowles continued giving the company more money, but even that was not enough to keep him out of debt. Process servers began visiting the office, from which Walt would have to hide. The few small jobs that the studio was able to pick up in between working on the pictorial films netted very little profit. In 1922, the biggest blow came when the Tennessee Pictorial Club declared bankruptcy, and Laugh-O-Gram would not be getting paid for the work they had done. Walt tried to break up the films that they had already made and sell them off to theaters, but the idea proved fruitless. So, the bad spot that Mace put them in by drawing up that awful, awful contract where not only did they not get paid ahead of time, but in a situation like this where they go bankrupt and they don't get paid at all.
Well,
Yikes.
Yep. However, Walt was not ready to throw in the towel yet and set forward with a new plan. Having been inspired by short films he had seen mixed with live action and animation, Walt and Laugh-O-Grams began working on a series called Alice's Wonderland. The films would include a live actress, 4-year-old Virginia Davis, interacting with cartoon characters in an animated world. based on the book by Lewis Carroll. I'm going to reread that because I have my commas all out of place and that sounded like garbage. Walt was not ready to throw in the towel yet and set forward with a new plan. Having been inspired by short films he had seen which mixed live action and animation, Walt and Laugh-O-Gram began working on a series called Alice's Wonderland. The films would include a live actress, 4-year-old Virginia Davis, interacting with cartoon characters in an animated world, based on the book by Lewis Carroll. Walt made a deal with Virginia's parents to include the use of their home as one of the sets, and production began. Walt told his distributors the film would be ready for May. It was not to be, though, as Walt faced a number of setbacks. Laugh-O-Gram was evicted from their office due to back rent less than a month after production began. Many of the employees saw the writing on the wall. They had been working for little to no money with little hope that there would be any to come in the future. Most of them, including Ub Iwerks and Walt Pfeiffer, left the company. Over the next few months, Walt and the few remaining team members bounced from location to location, not being able to pay the rent. Walt ended up having to do the majority of the animation work himself, and the project finished months after when he had promised the distributors. Even the completion of Alice's Wonderland made little difference to Laugh-O-Gram. The finances had reached the point where Walt had to sell off the rights to the film and nearly every other asset the company had to one of its investors. With that final blow, Laugh-O-Gram was through. Walt no longer had the money or means to produce any films and declared bankruptcy. Outwardly, Walt would not show defeat, and those around him would say that he kept in good spirits during that time. Though years later, Walt would admit how devastating it actually was, saying, "That first setback got me downright and out." He did all he could to pay back his creditors, even if it was only partial amounts. Kansas City had once again proven to be a letdown for Walt. Over the next few months, Walt bounced around throughout the city, scraping by how he could. However, the city and the fall of Laugh-O-Gram would not crush his spirits. Walt knew he had the charisma and the ideas to bring the dream of animation to life. He believed Kansas City simply wasn't the place to make it happen. Much like his father, Walt faced a financial defeat, and similarly to Elias, he would pack up and move to a different city for a new start. But unlike his father, Walt would not throw away his dreams and chase some new endeavor. For all it had taken from him, Kansas City provided Walt a new sense of determination and the start of a career he would become famous for. He sold off any remaining assets he had and saved up enough money for a one-way ticket on the Santa Fe line. Walt was on his way to Hollywood.
It's amazing how this dude just was like, yeah, everything's going terribly, but I'm just gonna keep going.
And it's so funny to me that how bad Kansas City was for him, just the entire time he was there, both times he was there. It's just sounds awful.
We talked about this in the first episode. You don't, when you look at a lot of this stuff with Walt, it's always a lot of the good stuff, and you see a lot of, you don't really realize how like you said, how bad Kansas City was for him, or how bad some of his early life was. And in a way, it's almost really inspiring to see where it ends up, I guess. They always talk about the CEOs in big companies that started out of a garage, but I think even with the Disney company, it's a lot more than that too.
Yeah. At a certain point, he literally was. He was started out of a garage too, But yeah, we talked a lot on here so far about the relationship he had with Elias and just how, man, dude, he was a hard man,
Oh yeah.
They had a very rocky relationship for a lot of this, and not only just in the relationship they had, the tough times they had in Kansas City, but also just not really having his dad fall back on for support with that. And luckily, as we'll get into, Roy was there for him. And I don't, as much work as Walt did and as passionate as he was and as much as he kept going, it's if it wasn't for Roy, none of this probably would have happened.
That's definitely true in later aspects for sure.
Mm-hmm. So Walt arrived in Hollywood in August of 1923 with little more than the borrowed suit he was wearing. After the struggles he had faced over the previous months, he had become thin and sickly. Roy, upon seeing him, said he looked like the devil. Though nearly all of his assets had been seized or sold off to creditors, Walt was able to retain a copy of the first Alice's Wonderland film he had made. It was one of the few things that he brought with him. But first things first, Walt needed a job. He was staying with his Uncle Robert while searching for employment, though Roy would later remark that he didn't believe he wanted a job all that bad. Walt still wanted to do something in the entertainment industry, so he went to various studios claiming to be searching for a job, but Roy believed he was just spending time there to observe the processes. However serious Walt was about these prospects, it was certainly not the only thing that he was working on. He picked up an old comic series that he began writing when he was in France and tried to pitch it to a number of papers, though that proved unsuccessful. During the time, Walt was also sending letters to a number of distributors about picking up the Alice series, and finally Lady Fortune would be on his side. One of the distributors that Walt reached out to was Margaret Winkler, a woman only a few years his senior. She was a Hungarian immigrant that came to America with an energy and focus that propelled her from a secretary at Warner Brothers to a film distributor through the connections she had made. By the time Walt reached out to her, she was representing the hugely popular Felix the Cat series, as well as the live-action / animated film Out of the Inkwell that had served as the inspiration for Walt's Alice's Wonderland series. Though she had found success in the industry, the time at which Walt contacted her found her on shaky ground. The producers of both Felix and the Inkwell series were separately threatening not to renew their contracts with her. With few other products to fill the void, Winkler was in a tight spot. She told Walt that she was interested in his series and had a copy of it sent to her in New York. And this is another thing, this is a pretty cool story, just learning about Margaret Winkler. Obviously in this time, in the mid-20s, it was very rare for, women to have this high level of a job. And on top of that, her coming in as an immigrant and then rising so fast. At this point in time, she was only 28 years old, which is is incredible to think of because, it was just such a different time back then.
Yeah, definitely.
And this, of course, sounds like just the person to connect with for Walt.
Yes. Another young, very passionate, quickly up and coming person in the movie studios. Obviously that was going to click. After screening the film, she wrote back to Walt that she believed the series could work, though he would need to do better camera work if she was to distribute it. She agreed to an initial 12-film series to pay $1,500 for the first 6 and $1,800 for each of the remaining ones. The contract also stipulated that the first film had to be completed by January 2nd of 1924. Walt was ecstatic, and upon receiving the letter, he went to visit Roy, who was recovering from another bout of TB at a veterans hospital. Walt's optimism quickly faded as he realized he had no means to produce the films and not a lot of time with which to acquire them. The first issue that Walt sought to face was that he had no money. However, his Uncle Robert could remedy that. Walt and Roy both believed that Robert would gladly provide some startup cash, but Robert had not made his money by playing bad investments, and that's exactly what he saw Walt as. He knew that he still owed money to others from the fall of Laugh-O-Grams, including some of their own family members. Robert refused to give him any money initially, though. Over the next few weeks, Walt and Roy eventually wore him down, and he gave the two a total of $500, though at 8% interest. So, Robert shared some similarities with Elias about being tight with money, but he was eventually able to give him some, though he was going to make money off of it too.
And that's the big thing right there.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny, Walt especially thought that this was going to be just easy goings because Robert was actually the one who had kind of talked him into coming out to California to get the fresh start and offered to let him stay with him. So Walt was like, yeah, Roy, this is going to be easy as pie. We're just going to walk in there and get some startup cash from him. And he was not playing around with his money, though. Another problem that Walt faced was that in his negotiations with Winkler, the contract stated that the film would star Virginia Davis, and she was still in Kansas City. Walt reached out to her parents and eventually convinced them to move to Hollywood to start production on the series. He would pay them $100 a month to begin with and increase payments over the next few months. Walt now had a contract, money, and a star, but he still didn't have a studio. He again turned to Roy looking for guidance. Though Roy helped him out to get the funds to start production, he hadn't actually planned on working with his brother through the process. However, after seeing Walt's optimism and innocence, he knew he needed someone to keep him grounded. He and Walt moved into an apartment together and shortly after found a one-story storefront at 4651 Kingswell to open up the Disney Brothers studio. As production began, Walt would film Virginia against a white backdrop, directing her to interact with the imaginary animals around her. After recording, Walt would run the film frame by frame and animate the characters in the white backgrounds. Then he would take pictures of each frame with the added characters and compile it into the final film. Though he worked on nearly all the technical aspects of the films by himself, he actually completed it ahead of schedule. He sent the first one to Winkler on December 15th, titled Alice's Day at Sea. Walt knew the production value wasn't at a very high level, and Winkler called it only satisfactory. She told Walt that the films needed more humor in them as well. Walt believed he had done just that on his second film he sent to her, Alice Hunting in Africa. But Winkler rejected it, saying, future productions must be of a much higher standard to those that we have already seen. Walt needed more help. Roy ran the books and occasionally operated the camera, but Walt couldn't handle the entire technical process on his own. By February, the two hired 2 men to help operate the camera and 3 women to assist in some of the smaller illustrations. Shortly after, they hired their first additional animator, Roland Hamilton. Winkler still provided feedback for each of the films, though. She was becoming more and more pressed with what the small studio was putting out. And in June, she visited the studio and told Walt that she wanted to up production now to 2 films a month. Again, Walt found himself needing help.
That seems to be the theme here.
Yep. Walt reached out to UB iWorks, who is now UB iWorks, and I know that doesn't make sense to anybody who is only listening to this because, yeah, he changed his name from UBBE iWorks, IWWERKS, to a shortened UBIWERKS. So
it's much easier for people to pronounce and remember.
Yes. But Walt reached out to him to convince him to work at Disney Brothers. UB had recently had a bit of a falling out with Colger at the film's ad company where he'd gone back to work. UB agreed and the team began producing films Winkler was very approving of. With the extra help animating, the Alice films began to see a new shift. New recurring animated characters were added, and more of the story was focused on these characters instead of Virginia. The team even began tossing around the idea of proceeding with only animation for the series. They were wary to change the formula too much. During the initial run of 12 films, Margaret became pregnant, and her husband, Charles Mintz, stepped in to take over for her. Mintz was much more critical of the production and much tighter with money. With a larger staff, it was becoming harder for Walt and Roy to see profits. In fact, neither of them took a salary from the studio until December of 1924, continuing to borrow money from Robert to get by. However, the initial runs of film was proving that they could make the studio work. In March of 1925, Mintz and Winkler signed another contract with the Disney Brothers, this time for a run of 25 Alice films. They would have to deliver 1 film every 3 weeks for the first 13, and then every 2 weeks for the remaining. Walt needed more help again.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty tight schedule they put him on. He hired Hugh Harmon and Rudy Ising, who had worked with him at Laugh-O-Grams, as well as an actual cameraman from Century Studios. And this was mainly at the request of Charles Mintz, who was still not very happy with the production value, I'll say, that the studio was putting out at this point. But so far, Hollywood was proving to be what Walt had hoped for when he set out less than 2 years prior. Though he was nowhere near the level of fame he was striving for, he had a start. Walt now had a strong team of animators and a steady contract of work. Above all else, though, he had Roy by his side. The two had worked together on the frigid streets of Kansas City delivering the paper, and now found themselves in sunny California running a studio together. So that's where we'll wrap up this part of the biography. I know I've been taking it pretty slow as far as the timeline of this. I mean, the first one we covered 1 through 17 first 17 years of Walt's life, and we only got through like 5 this time around. But I also think that this kind of area is
a pivotal time in his life.
And I also think that this is kind of that background of Walt that most people don't really know about, or if they do, it's very small bits and pieces of it. And I really think like we were talking about, to like understand and appreciate like what he made over the years after that, like you kind of have to see how crushing like the first part of his career was, to know what he had to work through to eventually build it up. So I wanted to stretch it out a little bit further on these. I don't know about you guys. I think we should maybe do a different episode next week,
that's
just
fair.
to kind of take a break from this. Yeah. And I'm planning on doing it. We're kind of starting getting into the actual like Walt Disney that most people know. So from here on out, it should probably be larger chunks of his life on each episode.
And I feel like this era of his life is also like when he learned a lot of the things that helped him in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very true.
So it's good to note the themes that are prominent in this era of his life. Going forward, you'll see them come back up again.
Mm-hmm.
Then that's going to do it for us this week. Thanks for joining us again on another episode of the Station 71 podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. If you want to read our show notes or find links to all of our social media, that can be found online at www.station71podcast.com. If you have anything you want to hear us talk about or any ideas for future episodes, be sure to email them to station71podcast@gmail.com. We hope you enjoyed your ride, and we'll see you real soon.
Please stand clear of the doors. Por favor, manténganse alejado de las puertas.